Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to another exciting Friday seminar. Happy to see all of your faces. Again, thank you all for coming. I'm Erin, I'm the seminar coordinator. Today we have Dr. Nidzieko. I actually didn't ask you how to say your last name. Is that correct?
That's how Steve Monosmith does it, but it's Nidzieko.
Nidzieko. Okay, thank you. Dr. Nick Nidzieko is a coastal physical oceanographer whose research focuses on how physical processes affect marine ecosystems, including the dynamics of estuaries, kelp forests, and the Santa Barbara Channel. He earned his BS in marine biology from UCLA and both an MS and a PhD in environmental fluid mechanics from Stanford University. Following postdoctoral work at PUI, he joined the faculty of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science at Warren Point Lab. He joined UCSB in 2016. Thank you, Dr. Nidzieko. Saw you.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for choosing to spend your Friday afternoon with me. I hope you enjoy a little bit of hearing about what we've been doing lately. And I also apologize for the appropriately generic title. It won't be as broad as just turbulent dissipation in the coastal ocean. It'll be more specific to kind of some things that we saw last Thursday. But you never know where you're going to end up on Friday when you start out on Monday. So as we get going here, I want to acknowledge and put out some acknowledgements and first recognize Dr. Alex Fisher, who I knew when he was a student at Horn Point, and then as a postdoc at UCSB with me, and he's now a researcher, scientist at APL at UW. This really is the co-author on all of this, although anything that's wrong is not his fault and is solely mine. I also want to thank the grad students in my lab for helping out with all of this work and keeping things in the water, and more importantly, making sure that things come back out of the water, and acknowledge that this is work that's funded by ONR and NSF. So the outline for today, the short story that I'd like to tell you is I'll give you a little bit of motivation with regards to why we're doing this, and basically, you could think of this as, I want to know if the in situ observations that we're making have a log normal distribution. That's the little mini story that we're going to tell today. And in parentheses there, it really comes back to also, do my in situ observations in the coastal ocean have a log normal distribution? I'll go into some methods then and present these observations of whether they do or don't, and then close with some future directions. So the motivation for this work is that I'm jealous of numerical modelers. I think it must be really nice to know everything everywhere all at once. And stepping back from that, I was reading this paper by Pearson and Fox-Kemper, in which they were looking at distributions of dissipation in global ocean models. And they found a log normal distribution for their whole model. And then if they drew smaller and smaller boxes, they saw continued to see statistical distributions of dissipation in the model at surface or at different depths that followed a log normal distribution. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I wonder if my observations follow and match up into how do my observations fit into this context of global ocean models? Back to my glib remark of wanting to know everything everywhere. When we go out into the field and make observations, we get just some slice through time or through space, and we don't really know everything everywhere. And so the context here for today is to think about, do these observations that we're making periodically at different places, opportunistically perhaps, do they have a distribution that fits within this bigger global context? Another way of thinking about this, or another way of motivating what I'm interested in, is are there some underlying statistical descriptions that might help make me understand my data better or make these results more accessible to others? Now, this isn't a new idea or a new issue. The statistics of turbulence have been discussed for a long time, particular the way that different eddies fit inside of other eddies. You can find a wealth of literature going back decades on this. Some pointing to log normal distributions, others pointing to distributions that are not log normal. But the statistics of this are still being actively discussed. This is a paper from JGR in 2019. And the authors here are looking at vertical profiles of dissipation collected with free-falling microstructure instruments in in the Southern California Bight, just a little bit south of the Santa Barbara Channel, where I'll show you some observations from. And they plot up their observations. The observations are in the top there, showing these vertical profiles through 150 meters of water. The colors represent the log 10 of dissipation through the different colored bars. And then they compile these into distribution functions in the bottom right there and ask the question, is this log normal or not? And the take home on this paper, they found that their distributions weren't log normal, but instead followed a Burr distribution. I must have not gone to stats that day because I'm not familiar with the Burr distribution, but nevertheless, there's still active research being done into how these observations fit into a global context. Additionally, a lot of what we know comes from observations in deep water, like on the previous example, where the water depths are on the order of a kilometer or could be measured in kilometers. And often these measurements are made from large ships. And so you'll note the observations in the panel on the right here start at 10 meters depth, because if you're collecting observations next to a ship, you can't have the ship getting in the way of your measurements. So our focus today, or I think a thing that's novel, partly novel to what we do, is that we're going to talk about very high resolution observations on the continental shelf using an autonomous underwater vehicle that can get close to the surface without having the presence of a ship or some sort of platform that's there. So as a framework, I'd like you to recall the turbulent energy equation. We don't have to go through the full, I mean, if you like Einstein's summation notation, we could break that out, but I'd prefer to just look at the words here of this equation. Basically within the turbulent energy equation, we're looking for change in turbulent kinetic energy, how that's transported around. And there's a shear production that creates TKE, and then that TKE goes to either the buoyancy flux or the dissipation. And the typical approach here is we make some assumptions, as we tend to do, and neglect some terms. We get to a balance between shear production, the buoyancy flux, and dissipation. And so what we see in this, or the basic paradigm here, of course, is that turbulence produced by velocity shear goes into rearranging the structure of the ocean, which is the buoyancy flux, or is dissipated to heat. And on back to some global level or basic level, how much of this energy goes into mixing, and the efficiency of that mixing is of fundamental interest. And so the reason that I'm talking about distributions of dissipation is that we care about when and where this mixing occurs in the ocean. This is my general introduction to what we're going to go through here briefly today. And so we'll move on now to talking about some of the methods, specifically a microstructure-equipped REMUS 600 autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV. Our REMUS 600 is called Kalinectes, or Kali for short. And what we did was we took our REMUS 600 and we equipped it with a microstructure instrument. We're using a Rockland Scientific Microrider 1000. You can see the instrument here. It's about 3 feet long, has a diameter of a little under 4 inches, and it has these probes that go into the silver receivers there on the left end. The right end has some plugs, and we basically just need to provide power from the vehicle to the microrider. And then the microrider is entirely self-contained with regards to the measurements that it makes. I know that some of you have experience with REMUSs there, or REMUS, I think you even have a REMUS 600. So we took if you're familiar, we took the standard REMUS 600 3-function nose, which has a variety of servos or pistons for releasing weights or floats. We replaced it with a frame that holds the microrider 1000. So it turns out conveniently that this bell cap that is at the front of the wet payload is almost exactly the diameter of a microrider. It's actually just a little bit smaller than the microrider. So without any modification to this part of the AUV, we're able to basically just modify the internals of the 3-function nose and slide the microrider straight into the wet payload, and then hook it up with a new dummy plug, or a new cable rather, to the forward end cap. So our present turbulence configuration for the vehicle includes an upward-looking acoustic Doppler velocimeter. It's a cabled vector from Nortec, for those of you who are familiar with that. And then we have the Signature 1000, also from Nortec, which looks upward. And it's just mounted in self-contained recording within inside the wet payload of the AUV. Then we have the microrider sticking out the front. You can only see the back of your head, so I'll assume that we're going at an okay pace. If this is too fast or too slow, raise your hand and I'll try and call on you. So the microrider holds a variety of instruments, holds several sensitive probes for measuring velocity, temperature, and conductivity fluctuations in the water very fast. And so these two probes on the bottom left with little airfoils there are called shear probes. The top probe with a little bit of a black covering over it is a fast thermistor, and then just barely visible behind the fast thermistor is a fast conductivity sensor. For those of you who aren't familiar with microstructure, the shear probes measure velocity fluctuations that are transverse and vertical to the vehicle axis at a very fast rate at 512 hertz. Basically, the principle of operation is that there's a small, a pair of dissimilar metals, and the small fluctuations cause those two metals to, the electrical current that's passed through those metals to vary slightly. So those small fluctuations are transmitted into or translated into electrical signals, which are recorded. And so by moving through the water, we're measuring the change in velocity through distance in the water, or dVdx. And we're measuring this both vertically and laterally to the vehicle. So we're measuring dVdx and dWdx. The way that we process the microstructure data is that we take the shear signals, the raw shear signals that are coherent with vehicle acceleration, and remove those in a Fourier space. This is after methods pioneered by Lou Goodman. We take this raw signal, and this little snippet of example, there's an acceleration. So the microrider contains two very fast accelerometers, very sensitive accelerometers to complement the microstructure probes at the front. So we take from the microrider, we take these signals of acceleration and the raw shear, put it into a processing routine provided by Rockland, which is a little more complicated than a fast Fourier transform, but you get the idea. And we end up with spectra of our observations. And so in the plot at the right here, there's a number of lines. There's the light gray lines, which show these are spectrum of the velocity fluctuations. The light gray lines show the spectra before the motions of the vehicle are removed. And so you can see several large spikes that are basically the result of the vehicle moving up and down as it drives through the water. The dark black lines then are the spectra that are after those vehicle motions have been removed. And so you see in a lot of the cases, so these lines here, I should note, are bin averaged by a decade of dissipation. So you see in some of the stronger dissipation estimates, 10 to the -6, 10 to the -7, you see basically a very clean signal in which all the vehicle motion has been removed. As we get into more sensitive and smaller dissipation levels, not all of the vehicle motions are removed. And then the final step in this processing is to take these black lines and fit them to the orange lines, which are Naismith spectra, which basically are theoretical curves of what these velocity fluctuations integrated through Fourier or spectral space should look like. The way that we deploy the REMUS locally, we don't have a large boat to deal with this large vehicle. The vehicle is about 13 feet long. It weighs 600 pounds. You often would need overhead lifting capabilities to do this. We built a small boat trailer and a cataract, and so we just deploy the vehicle at a boat ramp. Basically, you can see in the top left picture there, we take the vehicle and we pull it up into the raft. You can slide the raft off into the water, and then the vehicle is basically suspended out of the water, but protected by airbags next to the boat. We can move around the harbor this way, and then ultimately tow the vehicle to wherever we need to be, and lower the vehicle out of the raft, and then release a hook, and then let her on her way. With regards to missions, we run our missions using Moose IVP, which is a suite of autonomy software that basically provides like a backseat driver functionality to the main hydroid controller. And we do this because our desired operating mode is over a very short transect, many times, and you can't provide the basic hydroid or the basic REMUS software with more than a few waypoints without it becoming prohibitively difficult for it to digest all of that. So we basically use a series of behaviors within Moose that alternate between running horizontal transects and conducting vertical profiles. and optimize the time of GPS fixes so that we don't have a GPS fix in the middle of these horizontal transects. What we're going to do with regards to the data I'm going to show you is run this bow tie, what we call the bow tie, this bow tie circuit. So there's basically a bow tie that happens at 2 meters depth, then 6 meters depth, and then 10 meters depth. And after we run through each of those one time, we're going to do a full profile down to 35, or actually in the case of the data, I'll show you 45 meters depth. And then we'll repeat this. That whole circuit takes about an hour, and we're going to do this circuit for as long as we can have battery and conditions suitable for our purposes. So on to the observations, and I'm going to describe here a wind event, a set of observations from a single wind event in the channel, in the Santa Barbara Channel here. So we deployed Cali on an 18-hour mission here at the location of the star. So UCSB is over kind of this location right here where there's the two little headlands that stick out. Downtown Santa Barbara is in this, the middle of the region here. Ventura is over to the right, and this is the Santa Barbara Channel with the Northern Channel Islands offshore. And we'll come back to the inset picture here, shows a view looking from east towards the west. And you'll see the star here is just off of the Santa Barbara and the location that we're working. And I'll just point to these mountains that are here. This is the Santa Ynez Ranges. They run east-west. The Santa Ynez Mountains within the Western Transverse Range. And they run east-west here. And this is important with regards to the behavior of the wind that we're going to see in a couple of slides from now. So this bow tie that we ran was located 1 nautical mile offshore in about 90 meters of water. The vehicle needs bottom lock, and so we really can't operate in anything beyond 90 meters of water without the navigation performance being significantly degraded. In terms of the mission plan, the harbor is up here in the sort of top right of the photo. We deployed the vehicle here near this mark that's called E, and then the black line shows the track that the vehicle took. And so we transited down and out, and this little leg here, this little dog leg that's here, exists because there's often, during this time of year we were working, there was actually a cruise ship here. So we had to go around the cruise ship. And then the vehicle transits down cross shelf offshore, runs a long leg alongshore, so we can characterize the horizontal density gradient or all horizontal gradients prior to the start of the mission. And then comes back to this central location for the bow tie and proceeds to commence the bow tie portion of the mission until the timer runs out. So the mission was interesting, or I think it's worth talking about here because we observed a nice strong wind event. And so the plot on the left shows wind at the Santa Barbara Harbor through time at the NOS station, the NOAA weather station that's there. The dots indicate the wind speed, steady wind speed, with the little arrows representing the direction the wind is coming from. The red line there is the wind gust. We can see through time. And then the white area, the portion that's not shaded, is the duration of the mission. So we got into the water just before the wind came up, and then most of the mission proceeded through this strong wind event. And I'll note for you that the wind for the first 4 or 5 hours is very strong and from the southwest or west-southwest. And then right here around midnight GMT, the wind shifts to the north. And again, when it shifts to the north, you'll notice that the magnitude comes down a little bit. And then additionally, or importantly, the fetch with regards to the location is significantly reduced. And finally, the wind dies here around 6. We saw most of a tidal cycle and a half during the portion of the mission, but we won't talk much about the tides today. As you might expect or would hope, waves build through the duration of this wind event, and then basically the waves peak right around midnight and then begin to decrease again associated with this shift of the winds to the north. The period is shown here in a heat map down below. You can see periods in a very short period wind wave of 5 to 6 seconds through the duration of this, the strongest waves, and then kind of scattered 6 to 8 second period as waves continue to come in from the outer portion of the channel. But in terms of local generated waves, those were reduced significantly. So just a couple of slides here to give you a sort of physical context for what happened during this event. The water column restratified significantly, or in sort of the middle of the water column restratified after the wind direction changed. So the three heat maps here are three colors showing temperature in the top panel, salinity in the middle, and density on the bottom. Again, this is the duration of the mission shown here from left to right on the horizontal axis. Each of the bars here is the result of binning data from the vertical profiles that were conducted at the end of that bow tie. So that sort of down and up sequence that occurs. And so the depth here is basically from the surface down to 40 meters depth. Similarly, we can take and bin velocity observations during each of these large profiles. And we can see during the period of the first 5 or 6 hours of the mission, we see strong in the top panel are east-west velocities. So the red is to the east, west are blue velocities. The bottom panel are north-south velocities. And so in the top panel, we see strong velocities to the west, and also partially to the north. As I'm saying this, that sounds backward in my head. Oh, well, okay. No, I'm sorry. It's to the south. That's right. It's to the right of the wind. That's helpful. Apologies for that. And then notably, again, back to where the wind slacks off around midnight, we see then that the decrease or the changing wind stress allows basically a relaxation of water that's been pushed offshore during the wind event to come back onshore and float to the north in red at the surface and offshore to the south at depth. And this explains this process of restratification. The restratification is coming from a slumping of water that was previously moved offshore in an upwelling fashion. Another way of looking at this are basically the same data, but just with vertical profiles that are not binned and reveal some interesting structure. So the panel on the right, I'll direct your attention to first, shows density profiles moving through time. So the lighter colors are earlier in the mission, through the darker colors are later in the mission. These are each, again, about an hour, separated by about an hour. If we take the panel, or we take the traces that are here on the right panel, and we put them over on the left panel, but that just offset them by the time at which they start. So the top of each of the profiles is offset by the appropriate time in the mission. We can see a similar, basically a view of how the water column is evolving through time. Some fun things that we don't have time to talk about today include this nice little intrusion layer that's coming down through the middle of the water column. And then this restratification associated with a slumping or relaxation of the water that had previously moved offshore. I think the final thing I want to point out with regards to this, the plots that are here, is you notice that all of these density profiles, there's persistent stratification throughout this entire event. There's not a period in which the water column becomes well mixed by any measure. Okay, so on to the observations then of dissipation, and my quest to understand how do these observations fit into this log normal, possibly, or some other statistical distribution paradigm. So this is the observations from the entire mission. They don't have a log normal distribution. So you can see in the top right, you can see the vehicle path. You can see a few vertical profiles at the start of the mission to characterize stratification inshore. Transit offshore at 8 meters depth, followed by a profile to depth as we turn the corner. There's a horizontal transit at 8 meters all the way out to the west of the bow tie location, and then we profile back until we get to the location of the bow tie, and then you can see lots and lots of bow ties with 3 depth layers, followed by a vertical profile in the middle. And all of the observations are shown in this binned histogram down in the bottom left. The next few slides, we're going to just focus on hourly slices from the bow tie, because clearly this single set of the observations taken in total don't represent a log normal distribution. So we're going to focus on all the bow ties, and basically what we're going to see are the looking from the side of the 3 transects. And so you'll see both the outbound and inbound, or northbound and southbound rather, northbound and southbound horizontal transects at 2, 6, and 10 meters depth, followed by this vertical profile. And all the plots are going to follow this same convention of having color coordinating, that is the log 10 of dissipation, with lighter colors being low dissipation and brighter blue colors being higher dissipation. In terms of the general trend of what we saw here, the surface dissipation, or dissipation in the surface layer, tracks the wind speed. And so we can march through time here, just showing you 5 of these transects with the different symbols corresponding their position relative to the wind trace that's up in the top right. We can see strong dissipation in the surface layer for these first 3 observations. In contrast, the later 2 observations at 30.6 and 34, where the dissipation is much lower, basically near within the noise threshold of the instrument. Although notably, there are a little bit of patchiness, patchy areas of dissipation down in these deeper profiles. We take and say, well, are these individual transects, these individual hourly transects, do they have a normal distribution? And run them through a simple statistical test to figure out if they do have a normal distribution. The answer is no. None of these have a normal distribution. So basically, each of the observations on the left is paired with a histogram on the right. You can see the time with regards to the hour relative to GMT on May 11th. Over on the far right corner, and you can see, consistent with the wind being strong during the first half of the mission and weak during the second half of the mission, you can see dissipation being high when there's large wind, and then low dissipation when there's no wind. It's good when things match up with what you expect, right? So, except for the normal distribution, we'd look at the normal distributions just only within the lower portion of the water column. The lower water column has normal distributions during the wind event. So the triangles over on the far right show the mean location. So wherever there's a triangle, that's the mean location of that distribution. And the triangle signifies that it passed at a 5% threshold the measure of having a normal distribution around that mean. So during the wind event, we saw some normal distributions on these isolated profiles, but not during this patchier nature, of course, because there's basically bimodal distributions here. And so those aren't going to fit a normal distribution. I didn't check whether the individual patches have a normal distribution, but we look at the surface layer. It's slightly normal. I think that's the technical term. There's two sets of observations that meet this statistical criteria. And then there's a single observation during a very quiescent period here at hour 35. And finally, if we get even more granular with this and try and look at individual layers and basically just take observations from 2 meters and ask whether those were normal distributions, 6 meters, ask whether that's a normal distribution, and so forth, we see that we start to approach or have distributions of dissipation that are log normal. Probably should have put log normal on all these. I apologize. So yeah, that was the exciting take home. So moving on then to close out here, talk a little bit about future directions. So of course, we're going to do the usual physical oceanography stuff with regards to the data. We have our hammer. We like to swing the hammer. This will involve looking at the observations we have and asking questions like, could it be turbulent? And looking at the gradient Richardson number, looking at dissipation to find out, was it turbulent? And then looking at the buoyancy flux to find out if it did any mixing. But that's the usual stuff. And I'd like to go back to thinking more generally about what motivated me with regards to my comment about being jealous of modelers and how they happen to know everything everywhere. And the challenge of how we can think about how to interpret these results more generally in ways that might be useful to a broader community. So I just showed you 18 hours of microstructure data at 512 hertz. This gives me or gives you 3.3 times 10 to the 7 data points per channel coming out of the microwriter. We only looked at the shear profiles, or the shear data channels. And so that's, we needed 2 accelerometers and 2 shear probes. And so this gives us on the order of 10 to the 8th data points in this histogram. We think about, well, how can I make these 10 to the 8th points? How do we distill that down into something that's useful for everyone else in the oceanographic community? So for example, I'll just go through the challenges faced by my students, perhaps, in thinking about how they might integrate these data, these observations into things that they're thinking about. So for example, Luke Carberry is interested in patterns of chlorophyll and sea surface temperature from the surface and how we might understand mixing and residence time in the surface ocean from some of these snapshots, and how looking at different resolutions, for example, looking at MODIS versus Landsat, how that might change our interpretation of what we see with regards to patterns in the ocean. So all of these 10 to the 8th points that I just showed you are into a single pixel in a MODIS snapshot. Luke's whole little domain that he's looking at in the Santa Barbara Channel fits into a pixel within this Pearson and Fox-Kemper paper. So this is really a bit of a challenge, I think, in how we are going to integrate or scale up the meaning of these opportunistic observations into other things that are perhaps more informed through time and space. Similarly, we could think about these 18 hours of data that I showed, which is a pretty long time for running an AUV in the water, or at least an AUV in an area with lots of shipping and kelp. But these 18 hours are just a blip in an annual nitrogen budget that Cecily Tai is putting together. She's looking at trying to put together how total nitrogen budget for the Santa Barbara coastal inner shelf, and how it relates to the delivery of nutrients to and from kelp forests. So it's hard to think about, or it's challenging and interesting to think about how information collected during these 18 hours might inform something at an annual or decadal time scale. But I'll note that these 18 hours are way too long for a TikTok video. Cecily makes a lot of science outreach videos. And so that presents a different challenge of a different time scale of how to go from 18 hours down to 18 seconds in a compelling way. I think this also poses challenges for thinking about observations that span even shorter durations. So Jordan Snyder, for example, is flying drones in the nearshore using thermal cameras, trying to look at make estimates of fluxes within the inner shelf. And she's limited in time by the duration that you can keep an aerial platform up in the air. And so it's, what happens when you have even a shorter time period and still lots of data points with regards to drawing conclusions that go all the way up into, say, a scale of log normal distributions of dissipation in a global ocean model. The obvious answer here is that maybe we just need more observations. It's tantalizing to draw your Gaussian curve and say, well, perhaps we had lots more observations, we would fill out this parameter space. And hopefully Dana Myers, who's the newest member of the lab, maybe we'll find some progress in this direction for us. And I think, one thing to consider, of course, is that there's probably some avenue like fisheries where there's a catch per unit effort. You can go and say, how many fish did you count? But you had to go out and actually try to count the fish before you're able to say how many fish you had. And so I'm certain that there's some way to say, well, what are, how representative, or how might we scale up the observations that we took into some broader space that might fill out this curve. Ultimately, though, maybe I'm in the wrong business and the ocean is too hard and we should consider working in a different environment. Callie has already been looking into this. She decided that at the end of this mission, it was too much and she was going to try her hand at some intertidal surveys. Fortunately, the good folks at the Park Service found her and gave us a call, and we got her back with a little bit without too much fuss. We did lose the shear probes, though. So to conclude and wrap up this brief little story here for a Friday afternoon, my motivation here in the story was thinking about whether the in situ observations of dissipation that we're collecting have a log normal distribution. And again, this is motivated by wanting to put our work into a broader context in a way that we might be able to connect the dots between high resolution things that we observe and larger aggregated products that other people make. We have a microstructure-equipped REMUS that we do this with. And the basic take home from the short story that I showed you was that we really had to break down our observations into very, very small segments to approach this log normal distribution. And that leaves me with a really uncertain, open-ended, maybe let's go with open-ended situation with regards to next steps or how we might tie this back into the bigger picture. So I want to thank you for inviting me to spend a little bit of Friday afternoon with you. And I want to thank my students for their help in getting the AUV in and out of the water. Alex Fisher, shown here, taking care of our most precious piece of lab equipment, the espresso machine. And then finally, thank NSF and ONR for the funding in this. So I'll stop there and answer any questions. And I see Jamie's hand is up. Thank you.
So that was fascinating. I guess my first question is, why would you expect a log normal distribution even if the underlying turbulence is log normal? Because you're sampling a bunch of very different, you have the turbulent mixed layer, or turbulent not mixed layer, but a more turbulent upper layer, and then a very distinct different pattern. And it's not clear to me that a bunch of log normal distributions smushed together are going to give you a log normal distribution.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's why I guess I showed you data from one day, and we have, for this particular mission, we did this 5 times. We have another set of data from the East Coast off of the Chesapeake. And then we have a whole 2 weeks of data from up in Washington. And so I'm curious, I guess where this is going is I'm curious what happens if we take all of that. Does it start to fill out? Does it start to fill up the space that's there? Basically, it would have to come down to our events log normally distributed, not just the turbulence being log normally distributed. And yeah, I don't have another explanation as to, I don't have an answer as to why that should or shouldn't be that way.
Okay, cool.
I agree with you with the doubt of like, well, why? It's all these little patches, and all those little patches, as you noted, all those little patches aren't, there's gaps in the middle.
Yeah, and a lot of the previous work has been done in big, more homogeneous deep ocean environments. So anyway, it was fascinating. Thank you.
I think the thing to that point, I think one of the things that I thought was most interesting was, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised after having, well, I'll come back to why I shouldn't be surprised. I guess the thing I was surprised about was how quickly it got calm. It went from being from moderately energetic to just like back to this background level, and to me it happened very quickly. And I think when I made this plot, I was like, wow, it just kind of was here, and then poof, it's over this other direction, and it didn't like slowly decay away. And then I thought back to the first year I was a grad student, or I guess it was the second year, Heinz Pitch's turbulence class. The first assignment we had was we had to go, and we were supposed to get into teams and basically make a visualization of a turbulent jet. And so what we did was we took fluorescent dye and put dye in a syringe, and then squirted the syringe into a quiescent water, and then tried to take a picture of that jet to get our little visualization for the assignment. But within that, the thing that I noted was that as soon as you squirted that water in, it also like viscosity works, right? It happened very quickly. And so I thought of that homework assignment when I saw this distribution like getting quiet really fast. And I was like, oh, well, I guess maybe there's something in that like exercise that's there. And I shouldn't be surprised of it like just basically shutting off and stopping.
Especially since you always have this, there's always, it seems, stratification in your system. So there's always this sink of energy just hanging out. I mean, the one interesting question is what is maintaining the stratification? Has it just not had time to be homogenized, or is there some sort of shear strain process that is maintaining it and that the turbulence is competing with?
I think to that point as well, I was surprised that the dissipation down at the dissipation after the wind event at 35 meters, say, was stronger than anything at the surface during the wind event. That there were these little pockets of really sharp shear that were being basically my naive assumption is that there's all this energy that was stored up elsewhere in mixing that's now like some sort of little intrusion that's occurring and creating really sharp pockets of shear. I was surprised to see this, like, well, maybe there's something wrong with it, but it's persistent.
There's cool work by Erica McPhee-Shaw on turbulent nephloid layers that inject into the stratified water during upwelling and upwelling relaxation that are in that region.
I'll hunt those out. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, so I think we should probably, Sally, go ahead.
Yeah, really interesting presentation. Thank you. I was curious about your section of focusing on 18 hours for your data analysis. Was that because it was the best time to capture the most varied wind and turbulence events, or was it because that was the maximum endurance that the REMUS AUV could go, where you could get peak performance?
That's a great, valid question. So the previous mission we stayed on station for 25 hours to cover a full tidal cycle. The REMUS has a problem that's known as a MMR, or a mid-mission reset. It's a bug that lives somewhere in the software or in the electronics. And every now and again, basically the whole system goes through a hard reset. When it goes through a hard reset, it goes back into the state pre-mission, doesn't know that anything is wrong, and basically it doesn't know to call home. And so that's how we found ourselves on the beach, was at 18 hours, we had a mid-mission reset, unfortunately, and the vehicle proceeded to then drift into the beach. So we wanted 25 hours, we only got 18.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
I think Dr. Laxon.
Really interesting talk. Some of the distributions that you were showing, they passed the eye test, and some of the ones that you said passed the statistical test did not look normal. So I guess that's why you run statistical tests. But how sensitive is your test to that 0.05 criterion? I'm not saying that you should hack to make it pass the test, but if there's a reliable behavior that isn't just log normal, isn't that also interesting and useful?
Oh yes, absolutely. This was like I would say that portion of the talk has been very poorly explored.
Okay, well, I thought it was well explained, even if it was poorly explained.
There's a lot to do with regards to the statistical rigor of that. Let's say that's a Friday afternoon test and not a publishable test.
That's good.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah, Nick, that was a great talk, and I'm sorry to hear that you lost your shear probes. That's a bummer. I was just wondering, in terms of those probes, what kind of observational view do they have? Are they kind of like a point observation of where the REMUS is driving, or are they? I don't have a good sense. Do they see quite a large area, or are you sort of effectively providing sort of like a point measurement of your shear, and then from that getting your dissipation rate?
That's a good question. You're getting measurements basically right at the scale of, I'm trying to get rid of my new to computers. You're getting a measurement right at that point on the tip of the probe. So so you're getting the measurement right at that probe. But if, let's say that you have an overturn that's the scale of a meter, you're seeing water that is part of that overturn of a meter. But you don't know necessarily that you don't know necessarily that you're centered on that overturning eddy that's a meter tall, but there's not There's nothing more than just the water that hits that tip.
Okay, so just to follow up then from that specific example, would the level of dissipation give you a sense of the scale of, say, the overturn? Or I guess I'm just wondering how you sort of contextualize that within the water column. Say, I'm interested in overturning eddies, but I can only measure at this very small, scale.
Right. So the next step in this, like in your general microstructure turbulence analysis, is to go into calculating things like at each point where you made a measurement, comparing your dissipation to other things, notably stratification. And so if you bring in the buoyancy frequency into this, you can calculate things like a Thorpe scale, which is the scale of the largest overturn that you should be seeing. So there's good relationships between the level of dissipation normalized by the buoyancy frequency that relates to the overturning scale that you're seeing. And so that will give you a sense of how big the overturns were. The challenge for us right now is that you don't get if you're profiling, like in these pictures here off of the, in the Chesapeake plume, when you're profiling, you're getting a vertical profile. And so you have some background buoyancy frequency that's you have the vertical structure that's coincident with your shear probe measurement. When I'm going back and forth at a horizontal level, you're not getting enough vertical information to know perfectly what that buoyancy, what that stratification is like. And if we had more money, we would put more CTDs on the top and bottom of the AUV so that we could have that better constrained.
Yeah, very, very, very cool.
Quick question on the isotropy assumption that you made when you showed the epsilon formula. Could you talk a little bit more about the kind of isotropic assumption that you made? It was three-dimensional isotropy or homogeneity or?
Sure. Yeah, so the question is the nature of getting to dissipation from this spectrum. So the magic here is that there's an assumption that the turbulence is 3D isotropic, so that what you're seeing when you integrate across this wave number space is that the fluctuations you saw in V are the same as the fluctuations in W. And those were also the fluctuations in U that you didn't measure. And by assuming that the part that you didn't measure is the same as the parts you did measure, that you're able to accurately represent the dissipation, accurately back out or assume what the dissipation is. So the paper that I referenced here, the paper that Alex wrote that has the these well, these better plots are here. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at tiny little thumbnails trying to click on things. Here we are. This paper here, this GRL paper that Alex wrote when he was a postdoc here, he did a lot of comparisons with regards to the angle of it, how the angle of attack of the probes impacted or not the dissipation estimates, and basically has a 1-to-1 plot of the lateral versus the transverse versus the vertical velocity fluctuations, and found that very good agreement with regards to that 1-to-1 plot of estimating basically the shear signal from the vertical versus the transverse. So the isotropy holds out reasonably well for these coastal environments.
Val, I think you're next.
Oh, yeah. Hi, my name is Val Schmidt. I am not an oceanographer, well, physical oceanographer. I've only taken Jamie's class, so you'll forgive me. But I have done a lot of underwater work and with underwater vehicles, and we've mostly been doing seafloor mapping kind of stuff, but invariably there's scalar physical oceanography sensors of one kind or another, a thermometer or a dissolved oxygen or chlorophyll, photodissolved solids. Never sensors as sophisticated as the ones that you're using or for the purposes that you're using. But so my question is kind of general, and that is, I've always kind of challenged the scientists and the students who've been interested in those data sets about how they put those in context properly, because there's always a current advecting by while they're doing the measurements of transects back and forth at various depths. And so they're not measuring the same water column over and over again. And it always seemed to me to really confuse the topic quite a bit. And it's not clear to me that that's something that you suffer from because of the statistical nature of your measurements, but I wonder if you can kind of comment on that in general and provide any thoughts.
I mean, I think what you're expressing is perfectly framed the context of my joking motivation that I'm jealous of numerical modelers, that they know everything everywhere, and also that it's always right. Because our instruments are never wrong either, right? They definitely don't foul or have some sort of electrical issue. So I think that's a challenge of you collect some data and then you make a plot and then you think about, well, what's the story that I have to tell? How does this story fit into other stories that I've been told? Does it advance some understanding? And then you're like, well, okay, maybe not. I should do that a different way. And then you go do it again or not. And I think I feel like that's a challenge of coastal oceanography, that it's the smaller the system, the tighter the gradients, the sharper the gradients are, and the more challenging it is to make a good measurement that adequate. It's harder to capture the full variability of what exists when you can stand on the side of an estuary and see that estuary, for 2 years in a row, versus if you have the opportunity to go out in a ship to the middle of the ocean, you're like, okay, we're here, let's just get the water and go. So I think that I'm rambling now, but I think that that's a challenge of how do you put into context a limited set of observations. And I try and always make a cartoon sketch of what I think I'm going to see ahead of time, so that I can think, well, is this an adequate way of is this going to answer my question? But that doesn't always work. So I don't know if that answered the question or just killed time.
Great, thanks.
If I missed anyone over here, I know we have Tracy on the chat, and I think Jenna has a question as well. Okay, Tracy, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, really nice talk. I guess I was wondering, back to the sort of bimodal distribution of the dissipation that you measured, and Jamie had brought up the sort of intrusion layer. I guess I was just curious kind of what you thought was causing such high dissipation and sort of secondary low dissipation happening, especially lower in the water column.
It's a good question. I think so. If we bounce around here, so the bottom plot is north-south velocity. So this is cross-shelf velocity, and you can see, you can sort of see the midpoint of this blue southward velocity that's here, shoaling up through the water, and this is occurring through, on the next slide, this is occurring basically in this space here where there's stratification, there's some stratification. So I think that what we're going to see is, I think that there must be, I think that there's I think it's like there's like this large scale slumping that's happening, but I think there's also a slumping in this lower layer that's happening. And so I think that there's, I don't know, I think it has to do with just small density driven shear, like little instabilities, but I don't know for sure. I think that the data here are too binned to be able to see. And you can't, like this little intrusion that's really plain, it's very, very persistent here in the early hours of the early hours of the mission. That doesn't show up at all. Like I can't see that obviously in the representation here within the velocity. So I think when I plot the velocity using sort of different, better, if I don't bend the velocity so heavily, we might see things that will reveal what's going on in this, what's creating this shear in the lower layer. That gives to that bimodal distribution you asked about.
Jenna,
Real
last
quick.
question.
So I noticed in your setup, you had the ADCP and the ADB, and when you're surveying so close to the water surface, I understand if all ADCPs have a certain blanking distance. Were you using the ADV to make up for that blanking distance? Because even if it's a small blank spot, that could be a large percentage of the water column you're surveying. How did you use those two devices together?
That's a good question. Let me go to a picture. Oops, that's this one. There we go. So we have actually have 3 ADCPs on board. We have the signature 1000 that's here, and it was set up in 2 modes. It was set up to have half-meter bends looking upward in a burst, and it also had has a 5th beam, and that 5th beam was doing an echo sounder at like 2.5 centimeters. When we're running at 2 meters, the blanking distance on this unit is, I think, 50 centimeters. And so we're still getting at least a meter of water that's good when we're at that 2 meter depth. We also have in back or midships here, we have an upward and downward looking current profilers. And so those also have they have a blanking distance also in the range of 50 centimeters and bend sizes that are 0.5 meter. So we have a second. So the observations that I showed you were actually from those current profilers, not from the signature. And then the other thing that we have going for us is that we can run at 2 meters, and even if we're missing a little bit of the water during the 2 meter transect, we go down to 6 meters then, and we can have information near the water surface from when we're deeper down. But yeah, there's some stuff that we're just going to miss. And because these have this Janus 4-beam configuration, you're always going to have like 10% of the water column. The top 10% of the distance is not going to be resolvable because of side lobe effects. So the vector could fill in a little bit with that. The vector sampling distance on the vector is 15 centimeters from the head. So that it would be possible to get information out of that and fill in some of that blanking distance, but we haven't fixed that just yet. And for a while, we were running with 2 vectors. We tried doing this with a vector upward and a vector downward. You can see there's a little plug in this place where the downward vector looked. And we tried to power them separately. There's basically 2 separate canisters inside. And even though they're supposed to be syncable and run together, we found that they had too much interference with each other electrically, not acoustically, but electrically, that we just couldn't be confident that we were getting good data. So we eliminated one of the vectors. And then I should have put the picture in that turns out when you put your AUV on the beach, that the people who are nice well-wishers and want to get your vehicle away from the rocks find this to be a very attractive handle. And so when we got to the beach, I was handed a vector head. He was like, "Here, this fell off." I was like, "Oh, thanks."
Excellent, thank you.
So I'm Shastri, I'm sorry, I know that you have like 5 million more questions, but we should probably follow up now. Is there any last for anyone? Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nidzieko. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk.